If you've ever faced a difficult transition in ministry, and that could be a job loss or a change in calling, or just navigating a season of personal failure, then you know how crushing it can feel. But what if the very thing that breaks you open could also be the thing that shapes you into something that's stronger, into something that's deeper? This is part 2 of my conversation with Brian Fisher from Soil and Roots. And we dive into the hard lessons that he's learned after being forced out of the ministry that he built. And Brian shares how this lesson, though painful, led to a new kind of ministry. That it's really one that's focused on forming deeper, more authentic discipleship. And so listen to this if you are in the middle of a tough season or you're questioning, trying to figure out what's next, because this conversation is packed with hope. There is insight, and there's a reminder that God often works in the hardest moments. Don't miss the rest of this powerful story. Let's dive in. This is the Life After Ministry podcast. When I saw that you booked this time and this day, I think it was like 6 weeks ago, and I was so frustrated that I was going to have to wait this long to have this conversation with you. So this is living up to everything I was hoping for. Thank you. I want to talk about what has become of your life. And though you might not count it as a success, I think that your thoughtfulness and what the Lord has been teaching you, and as a result of what's coming out of you, is a really beautiful thing. And it's reminding me right now, you gave me a Soil and Roots sweatshirt that I fully intended to wear today. And for multiple reasons, I wish I was, because I'm also freezing cold right now. But tell me about the origin, the organic nature of what has flowed out of your life, and the subsequent not taking the world by storm nonprofit that is Soil and Roots.
Well, as part of the first or 2 years after all this happened, I was in this deep introspective, halfway depressed, sometimes fully depressed state. And so I began to do a lot of serious self-introspection, and also inspecting the church and the people that I had surrounded myself with for many years. And I came across Dallas Willard, who I'd never heard of. And he had written a book called The Great Omission. And he said, modern Christianity struggles worldwide with the great omission. We talk about making disciples, but we're not actually making disciples. We're making converts. Maybe we're making educated converts. But in terms of seeing the church as a character-forming institution in which we become holistically formed more like Jesus, he said, it's just not happening. And frankly, our churches nor our parishioners have the expectation that that's what we're supposed to be doing. Because, having worked in the pro-life movement for many, many years, I always thought we were missing something upstream. Like, the question would be, why is it that this is even a thing? How is it in a world that claims to have whatever it is, a quarter or a third of the world's population following Jesus, would anybody think it's a good idea, whether they follow Jesus or not, to kill their preborn child? And so I concluded, rightly or wrongly, that upstream from abortion, upstream from the gender wars, upstream from all of the stuff that makes the 6 o'clock news, I think Willard was right. We are not making people who think, act, relate, and love like Jesus. We're making people who get their ticket to heaven and then go about their lives for the most part and just try not to screw up. Yeah. He called it the gospel of sin management. So I started to explore it in a podcast called Soil and Roots. And then a year later, some friends said, hey, we think, I think we should test this, because I concluded that true discipleship is best accomplished in very small groups in such a way that encourages safety, vulnerability, intimacy, and practices some things that the ancient church practiced all the time that we've all but lost in the West. And so a year and a half ago, we started beta testing. So we call it a greenhouse. The greenhouse is a group of 4 to 12 people who get together for a few hours a week to become more like Jesus. It's different than the church service. It's different than a Bible study. It's different than most small groups. But I think all 8 people in our greenhouse would say it's been the most formative thing they've ever done. And so the desire of Soil and Roots is to say, hey, look, if the modern church is good at stages 1, 2, and 3, then there's room to step into stages 4, 5, and 6. But it needs to look radically different than what we think church is. Our modern churches are great. We love them. We love our pastors. We love our priests. They're doing great work. I'm not dogging the ministry that's happening there. But if you accept the premise that worldwide we're not making disciples, and the primary is because there is no help or guidance into these later stages of discipleship, which transform us to think, act, love, and relate like Jesus, well, then we got to deal with that. And that is absolutely best accomplished in small, vulnerable, intimate groups, not by simply sitting through a 30-minute monologue each weekend. That's not how human hearts are formed. And the podcast and the book and the ministry all sort of make a case for why that's sort of what Jesus modeled. Like the 3 years he spent with his disciples. It's not rocket science. We just need to go do that instead of building 5,000 person mega churches that are more businesses than ministries.
Can this happen in the walls of a church?
Well, that's a fascinating question, man. I just had a conversation 3 weeks ago with a pastor in Georgia who had been a mega church pastor, left that because they weren't making disciples, started a small church that isn't making disciples. And he said to me, your best shot is to find the duns. He said, not that church institutions won't eventually grasp on to true spiritual formation in small community, but if you start there, there's no way it's going to work. And so go find the people that are either curious about Jesus and fear stepping into a church, or people that are just in stages 4, 5, and 6 that have nowhere to go and want to become people of depth. I mean, Richard Foster said, what the world needs most is not more gifted people or smarter people. It needs deeper people. And that's the whole point. Soil and Roots is designed to produce deeper people. And my pastor friend said, that is not what is happening in the current church institutions. They need it, but I'm not sure I would look at modern church institutions to be early adopters at something like this.
It's where, and we've talked about this, and I talk about this a lot, but I'm always fascinated by the character of John the Baptist, who is born into a high priestly family. And yet in the Gospels, we don't ever see John ever in the temple complex, within the walls of the temple, not serving alongside his family. We always see John outside of the walls, and he's somewhere in the wilderness. And even then, I imagine he wasn't all that impressed or getting excited or trying to figure out a way to scale what was going on in the wilderness, even though, Josephus says that thousands are coming out to see him. But there is something out there. And what I'm finding is, now that I think what we're doing with pastoral transitions and some of the other things and projects I'm working on is I'm operating and finding some of those folks outside the walls of the institutional church. And not that I'm done with all of that, but I think that there's a different kind of ministry and a different kind of person out there. And I don't know if we can, how do you get somebody who's in the early stages to want the depth of life that is beyond, who was it? Maybe it was my dad who said this, or, I have so many conversations, but, it's interesting that our picture for the life in Jesus of going from death to life is water baptism. And I'm not saying that we change it. It is kind of a biblical thing, but I think it was my dad that said, what if we actually, like, the baptism process of that death to life picture is not coming out of the water, but it's coming out of a grave. And that, if somehow we could just kind of hole out some cliffs and we have some holes in the rock and you go in and you come back out of a grave or a tomb, that's a better picture. But that there's something to be said and to think about of, man, there is something that's happening outside the walls of the church that is a very deeply Christian spiritual thing, but because it doesn't take place within the organization of it all, we can't write it off, right? Like, we have to pay attention to it. So anyway, it's the thing that really, like, beyond, like, you've set up this ministry and it's growing and there's a book and you write about this a lot. There are communities and there are pockets of this, but I wish that this was something that could take place, that we could see this kind of depth in the church, because as somebody who's been trying to go to church and finding lots of churches, there is a shallow, we haven't gone past the wall, and I want to see this happen for the kingdom, right? Not just for myself, but how does that happen? So, and I'm asking questions I don't fully have answers to.
First of all, again, I'm not a revolutionary. I don't think we should be tearing down church structures and rebuilding healthy traditional models. What I am saying is that we have to deal with reality. My brother, for example, goes to a church, small church that I think is deeply formative. And that is being led in such a way that exemplifies many things we talk about. The challenge is that the modern spiritual formation movement, and I mean that the movement to help us experience the abundant life now versus a surface sort of, belief-centric only Christian life, has been around for 50 years. And I have asked and asked and asked people that have been in the movement, like, why hasn't it developed into communities? So we have spiritual retreats, we have lots of books, we have what's called spiritual direction, which is people that help others kind of listen to the Holy Spirit and hear from God. And they're all wonderful. But where are the pockets of people that are gathering together to do this all the time? And universally, there's sort of shrugs. Well, have you tried it in your local church? Yeah, but it's a threat to the power structure of the church. Yeah, but they don't like the term spiritual formation. Yeah, but I have a friend in College Station who I had on the Soil and Roots podcast. He said, look, I'm going to be honest with you. I've been in pastoral ministry for 40 years. The primary reason why modern church institutions don't engage towards stages 4, 5, and 6 is because they get their budgets met without having to do it. Because 4, 5, and 6 are deeply personal, they're time-consuming, they're messy, it requires substantial relational investment, and the modern, particularly American church structure isn't even set up to do that. So if the payrolls gets met and the building fund gets paid for, there's no reason to engage in the messiness of that because the institution is going to persist. Now, that's a pretty cynical perspective, and I'm not that cynical. I've been in the institutional church my entire life, and I have a deep love for it. At the same time, I would agree that church institutions with all of the power pieces that have to be maintained there are probably not the place to start exploring how 4, 5, and 6 become real in the life of a person chasing after Jesus. And I don't want to say that, but it's hard to conclude otherwise.
How is like what you're doing with greenhouses? How is that different than just? I'm thinking that there's somebody who's listening, a pastor who's listening, and they're saying, "Well, no, this is what small group ministry is about. We have small groups. There's small groups all over the church. What's the difference between what you're trying to do and a small group ministry at a church?"
Well, they might be right. I'm not saying universally small groups are not particularly formative. Most of the small group efforts that I've been involved in or that I know about are Bible studies. The point is to take what has been taught and to distribute that information to a person. Now, the problem is anthropologically, it makes an assumption that we are formed to be more like Jesus by the intake of information. That's not true. The whole Western Christian model is based on teaching. I argue in Soil and Roots that there are actually 5 elements that are best suited for us to be formed more like Jesus, and instruction is only one of them. So if you're small, I was in a church once, this is a true story. I was in a church one time where I was being trained to be a small group leader, and Jessica and I have led small groups for decades. And in the training, they said, hey, look, we're going to use the pastor's sermon notes. Okay. There's only one rule. As you teach this stuff, you're not allowed to disagree with anything the pastor said. And I stepped back and I thought, okay, this is the opposite of what a greenhouse is. Like in our greenhouse, there's a Catholic, we have a Pentecostal, a couple Reformed people, a few dispensational people. I mean, it is an eclectic mix of people, and we wrestle. And that's the point, because, you're Jewish. What's the name Israel mean? It's fairly straightforward. So if the point is to be taught what the pastor says is correct, and that's just going to form us, I have categorically begun to disagree with that. If we're not given the opportunity to wrestle, to disagree, to doubt, to question, and really marinate in these things, that is what forms a person in part. But the other elements, time, habit, community, and intimacy, those are the other 4 elements, must be present. And to be honest, most small groups don't embody any of those. There's no attempt to practice spiritual disciplines. You spend 90 minutes every 2 weeks with a group of people that you don't see otherwise. It's hard to cultivate intimacy in groups that are only expected to be together for 6 months, and they don't really define community. And there's a lot of folks that think the modern small group movement, which was an attempt to sort of replace Sunday school, just hasn't been particularly effective. I think in some cases it absolutely is. But do I think most of the small groups that I've been a part of have been formative? Have I walked away being more like Jesus? That hasn't been my normal experience.
So coming from where you're at, today? Are you thankful for the journey that you've been on? Do you feel like what you're producing and what God is producing in you and through you, like, are you at a point where you feel like, in your life after frontline vocational ministry and a nonprofit, are you at a point where you can say that you feel thankful for even the hard stuff? Or is that something that's not there yet?
No, most days. I mean, it's only been in the last year, but yeah, most days I'm deeply thankful for my time in the organization. It was as hard as it was thrilling, and it was an honor to be able to work with so many families and to be a part of an effort to bring the kingdom in that sector. I'm thankful for the people that I engaged with. I made mistakes. I've made poor relational decisions, and I've worked through those, and I wish them well, truly. I mean, most days I'm no longer angry. It's more sadness. But the journey afterwards, it's been, in many ways, it was the worst 2 or 3 years of my life, truly, and for my wife. But you do get to the point, and I'm sure you've been through it, where there's a book called Hind's Feet on High Places by Hannah Hurnard.
Yeah.
And her companions, Much Afraid is the main character. Her companions on the journey are suffering and sorrow. I mean, you start reading the book, you're like, this lady was on marijuana or something. But as you work through the book, by the end of the book, Much Afraid's name is changed. She's no longer deformed. And her companions, instead of being suffering and sorrow, become joy and gladness. And there is a point where the suffering does become good, and you see it as a welcomed friend. I'm not that way every day. There are days where I still struggle with the loneliness and the rejection that comes along with these types of situations. But if there's a fellowship of suffering, if I have some tiny, tiny, tiny experience that helps me relate to Jesus and what he suffered for us, there's an absolute goodness in that, and it's something to be thankful for.
Have I talked to you about dredging?
Mm-mm.
I don't know if I've told this story on here. If I haven't, I'm surprised I haven't. But in one of my walled seasons, dark nights of the soul, and unfortunately I've had more than one, I remember like my go-to, thankfully, was pretty healthy, was I went to work out like a fiend all the time. And going through that season, I'm on the treadmill, and I absolutely, even to this day, hate exercise. I need every distraction possible. And and this is the days of, you couldn't watch a show or something on your phone while you're working out. It was a while ago, but I'm on a treadmill and I'm watching a show. You have like 4 channels of options, and the History Channel is on. It's really all I had at the moment. And, any port in the storm will do for me. And it's a History Channel show about dredging. And I didn't even know what dredging was, but the concept is that when there's a lot of rain, the rain floods the rivers carry down all kinds of debris, and the debris will just drop. Eventually those rivers connect to a lake, and all of the debris that is carried with the river, all of that debris ends up eventually into the lake. And over time, what takes place is the debris in the lake becomes so much so that it starts to kill the life in the lake. And so what we've figured out in modern technology is if we get a whole bunch of boats to skim the surface and go down, and they have these lines that go down and basically dig up and trench up all of the debris, bring it to the surface, and then carry it off and get it out of the lake, that the lake can actually have new life and grow again, instead of all that debris killing the ecosystem that's in there. And I remember like this, toothless kind of fisherman, like, boat guy, sea captain, who's out there and he's talking, and behind him, you see these ropes that are going down. He says, we call these the Jesus lines because if you get caught in one of these, the only thing that's going to save you is Jesus, because these lines are going all the way down to the bottom of the lake and bringing stuff up. And I was in this season where I'm working out and I'm in pain, and I'm watching this toothless guy talking about dredging, and I'm crying on the treadmill. And I just thought, man, what a powerful picture of like God was using in that season to bring stuff up in my life, take the debris of my life to bring it to the surface and remove it. And what I thought was fascinating is this picture of the process of dredging while it might be painful and it's hard to bring that stuff up and then to give that over to Jesus, it's actually deepening the lake. When you're actually digging out the bottom, there is a depth there that's really beautiful. And the conclusion to all of this was they said that just taking the debris and getting it up out of the lake is not enough to actually produce new life in the lake, that they have to actually plant things, algae or coral, whatever, I have no idea. But they actually have to plant things to be able to put new things into that lake to be able to grow new life. And I mean, I think that's a bit of the journey in the wilderness. It is, I think what you're trying to do in the world of soil and roots is let's take some of this stuff, and there's a confession and there's a knowing of one another's stories, and let's bring this stuff up and love the people in the midst of it. And at the same time, we're gonna confess our sins. We're gonna move forward, and we're gonna add some of these things, time and habit, and really build a practice in our lives that we're actually growing deeper and we're growing healthier, right? So that we can actually begin to see stages 5 and stages 6 develop. Is that?
I think it's a wonderful analogy. I mean, I define a deep person, again, under the premise that what the world needs most is deep people. A deep person is somebody who is increasingly attuned or awake to God, others, themselves, and creation and culture. And that definition doesn't resonate with everybody, but I'll say it again. Somebody who is increasingly awake or attuned to God, themselves, others, and creation and culture. I don't know if we become deeper people, because the more attuned we are to God, creation, culture, others, and ourselves, the more equipped we are to love, like Jesus loves. That process of becoming deeper invites us to look at the assumptions and our true desires at the bottom of our hearts, which we do everything we can to avoid. I'm talking about people sitting in church. Mm-hmm. So if somebody has a people-pleasing tendency or is performance-driven or whose thought life is littered with shameful messages, even as they sing worship choruses, that's where the inward journey really starts to becoming a deeper person. And I think, to your point, the dredging of that, especially in our distracted age, is something that, unless we hit the wall and decide to embrace it, we're probably going to do whatever we can to avoid it. But I can certainly say that through the 4 years following these events, my capacity to understand my own heart and to have a deeper experience with God's heart and to love people better and to see God not only in the Bible, but in the created order, those things have all increased because he has gently, compassionately invited me to dredge. But my point is, that's best done in communities that are there to dredge, and they need to be small. The church should be growing smaller, not bigger.
Oh, and I almost just wonder, like, how do we take somebody who's new to the faith and invite them into that conversation? Like, can you get there without having to hit the wall? And there's just a holistic, we want to invite you into the deep, instead of the invitation is, we don't want to make this too hard. We don't want to go too deep too soon. We're going to have the beginner's class. And obviously there's a stage where we do need to wake up to the presence of God. We do need the educational reading the Bible. We need to be pouring our lives out. But how can that be? Maybe it's too much to do all at once. I mean, again, this is probably more theoretical and trying to live it out and see if this works. But that's the hope, right? Can we invite somebody into the deep end right away?
I think it's possible. I hope that that's the future of the church. Not that we should be skipping pieces and parts, because thank God for his patience and his gentleness and his long, long suffering with me. But I think there might be a question underneath the question, which is, can we at least start forming communities to help each other through the wall when it inevitably comes? Maybe it can't be skipped. Maybe that's part of the human experience. But perhaps we would suffer more transformatively. We would suffer better. We would experience God's witness if we really worked on putting those communities together. I mean, Dallas Willard said that true discipleship looks a whole lot more like AA than what we typically experience.
Right.
And what is AA? Bunch of guys, bunch of gals getting together, being very raw, being very authentic, practicing what it means to be healthy, in a way that is oftentimes uncomfortable. And yet their track record of recovery speaks for itself. I kind of think that if there's one institution that should model true community, it should probably be people chasing after Jesus.
Yeah.
And that's what we hope to foster.
Yeah. Brian, this has been every bit as wonderful as I was anticipating. Thankful for your story and working through the hard things and still in process. I'm thankful for the ministry of Soil and Roots. Thankful for our friendship and being able to have these conversations. I want people to be connected to you. What I love is that there's life after ministry.
There is.
And there's ministry after ministry, which is what we say. And you're living proof of that. And so there's hope for anybody who's listening who is on day 1 or day 7 or maybe day 700 and still feeling like, when is this going to end? That God is still going to be faithful in all of that. But I want people to be connected to the work that you're doing at Soil and Roots and greenhouses and all the things. How do people connect with all things? And by the way, your site is not just beautiful from a messaging and the words and the intentionality that you put in, but it's also pretty. It's nice to look at. But how do people connect with you?
Our site is so good because you wrote it. That's why it's so good. It is.
We did it together.
Well, the website is soilandroots.org. That's a great way. You can email me just directly at fish@soilandroots.org. I've been doing a lot of writing on Substack, so if your audience likes to read more long-form content, I've been exploring the Great Omission, genuine spiritual formation, how we come together in small communities there. You can just search for Soil and Roots on Substack. And then, we have 100 and some episodes of the podcast that have been available on any platform. Just search for Soil and Roots. It's always good to start at the beginning because it's sort of laid out in a logical way. It describes the Great Omission and then what the process is by which we evaluate that. But, you can jump in wherever you want, but it might make more sense if they want to check it out, start with episode 1. But that's just Soil and Roots, and it's, everywhere that every podcast is. Those are the best ways to connect with us. Love to hear from people.
That's good. Brian, thanks for joining us on Life After Ministry podcast.
Matt, it's always a pleasure. Hope to see you soon here in Dallas. Come on down. Yeehaw.
All right. So many thanks to Brian. Brian, thank you for your word and the testimony, the word that God is still doing. There's transformative power of walking through hard seasons, but doing it with God. And if you're in a season of transition and struggling to see the light at the end of the tunnel, I encourage you to reach out. At Pastoral Transitions, we are here to help guide you through the wilderness and into that next season of your calling. So if you or someone you know is facing a tough transition, don't do it alone. We can talk and begin that journey together. And if you have a heart for pastors or people who are coming out of a ministry position, vocationally, they're trying to figure out what's next. They don't necessarily have the funds and finances to be able to make that happen. And you want to be able to give and help support pastors who are in transition. You can go to pastoraltransitions.com. There is a button there that says donate, and you can give towards that. And we put all of that towards the work that we're doing here. Thanks for listening to the Life After Ministry podcast.